Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the IHE for the people who are not working or studying here. My name is Willemijn Nagel, for the ones who didn't know that. And I'm going to introduce to you Professor Dietz from the African Studies Center in Leiden. He's doing many other things, but I won't give you a whole overview. He's so kind to be here today and share with us his view and information about Africa in the year 2100. It's very far away, so you might say nobody can say anything about that year, but with all the information available in the world these days, he can, and we collected it from a lot of sources, and I hope you find it interesting as well, because as I found it when I heard the same, more or less the same presentation at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Biowada wants to share these kind of nice seminars with you because we think it's good to see the other views on Africa, to see what's possible, what's not possible, and you might have a lot of questions, and we would appreciate if you could keep them with you till after the presentation, because if there are some students, I'm not sure, are there students now in the room? Yeah, they have to leave. We will give them first the time to ask the questions, and if people can stay longer, that's possible, because we need a reservation for a longer time. So, yes, please, have a nice hour, I would say, and enjoy the presentation.
Thank you very much. And it will be a bit of a whirlwind, because there's a lot to share. When I became professor in Leiden and director of the African Studies Center, I provoked many people by giving a speech called Silver Lining Africa. And I decided to highlight the positive stories about Africa. And I could do that on the basis of some of my own research, based on local level research in the north of Ghana and the southern part of Burkina Faso, which clearly showed the enormous progress that that area had made in the period between 2000 and 2010, partly already starting in the 1990s. So also I connected that to the more macro level data, which also showed emerging Africa. It really showed that there was change in the air, and that the doom and gloom stories about Africa that so much dominated the international discussion until the 2000s had really to be rethought and really to be put in a different perspective. And I call that the Silver Lining Africa perspective. Of course, the period of very high growth in Africa between 2000 and 2014, as I will show, was a period which was quite exceptional, and as I will probably show to you, it probably ended in 2015. So I think that the silver lining story now needs serious rethinking again. But during those 10-15 years of high growth, the growth in Africa was real, it was broad, and it of course didn't reach everybody, but it reached an enormous number of people. And of course, part of it was caused by what everyone knows, the high prices of raw materials during that era, the high demand from Asia for Africa's produce, the role of China also in Africa. That was all quite self-evident. But I have been trying to show in my research the last 10 years that it goes beyond that, and that there's a lot of momentum in Africa itself. Now, what I also see, and of course everyone does, that the world has reframed its global goals, from the Millennium Development Goals to the Sustainable Development Goals. Everyone knows them. Everyone here will be very happy how prominent water is in 2 of those 17 fields. But also that these global goals are more bold, more social democratic in a sense, than the Millennium Development Goals were, that were really the goals belonging to the era of globalization and neoliberal dominance of thinking. But the big problem that I see in those global goals, and if you look at it, how it's being phrased, is that it completely lacks a demographic perspective. And I would like to bring in the demographic perspective first. Let's first look at some basic figures. In the year 1650, Africa had the same number of inhabitants as Europe. And that also means the same percentage of world population. In the year 1900, Europe had its enormous population explosion, has had it, and Europe was at the height of its economic and political power around 1900, with about 25% of world population. Africa's demographic presence had dwindled just to a mere 5%. In absolute numbers, more or less the same as it was in 1650, but in relative terms, just hardly nothing, nothing again. Now, in 2015, Europe's population had more or less stabilized at this level, a little bit more than in 1900, but not much. And look what happened in Africa. So we talk about the demographic explosion, population explosion in Europe between 1750, 1800 and 1900. But look at Africa. Its population probably became 10 times more in just a bit more than 100 years. That's the situation already. What's also very clear, if you look at the current situation of fertility, how many children a woman gets in her lifetime, then Africa has become the big exception. Everywhere else, the fertility levels are close to replacement rate. Replacement rate around 2.1 children per woman. Africa is still the really big exception, as you can see on the map below. It's currently 4.64 children per woman. Big differences within Africa. The world champion fertility is Niger, where an average woman gets 6.76 children in her lifetime. And that includes all the women who can't get children. And those are life-born children. Of course, part of those children die before they are 5 years old, but still the numbers are staggering. Followed by Burundi, followed by Mali. But what is much more problematic, because Niger, Burundi, Mali are countries with a considerable population, but not a huge population. But a huge population can be found in Nigeria. Look at Nigeria. 5.19 is the figure. There are exceptions. An interesting exception, which I will also highlight a little bit later, is South Africa. South Africa is one of the very few countries in Africa very much coming close to replacement level. Kenya is an interesting example, because Kenya used to be world champion in the 1980s. The Kenyan average number of children per woman was more than 7 at some point, 7.5 at some point. Kenya has also succeeded to drop considerably. But overall, for Africa, it is still high. So, what do you have in Africa? A very young population, many girls who will still get many children, far above replacement rate. A growing life expectancy, so people living are no longer dying on average in their 50s, but they are now dying in their late 60s, and it's rapidly going up. So for many decades to come, there will be a very high population growth in Africa. Very high. And that's, of course, a big difference with Europe. Now, just a map to show what's happening. You can see on the map of Africa the light yellow color, if that's visible on your screen. And the light yellow color means the modal age is between 14 and 20. For instance, Niger 50% of the population of Niger is younger than 17 years of age. 50%. So what are the demographic predictions as far as we can get them from the, say, the long-term predictions? For the year 2030 we can be pretty sure, because lots of those things are already in the making, so to say. For the year 2050 and 2100 it's a bit less sure, but the minimum prediction for Africa is 3.4 billion. The minimum prediction. And the demographers say there's 95% chance that Africa will have at least 3.4 billion people in the year 2100. It's much more likely, though, that the average figure becomes reality, and that's 4.4 billion. And there is another column, that is the high-end predictions. Those are in the 5, almost 6 billion. But I leave those out, because I don't think that's very realistic. It will be somewhere between 3.4 and 4.4. This is what you get if you compare Africa with Europe, and also if you compare the high-end and the low-end predictions. They come to, for the year 2100, at a almost 4.4 on average, as I said. And Europe, in this prediction, will go down. Of course, depending on Fortress Europe, because Europe's growth already depends for a large part on migrant children. Because on average, migrants have more children than the indigenous population in Europe. And also, migrants more or less are responsible for the growth of population. Without that growth, there would be even a lower diminishing population. But that depends. Now, this is not to say that there is no demographic transition going on in Africa. Because it is. And it's already going on for quite some time. I'll show that. This is the figure which looks at the period between 2000 and 2050. These are the different predictions, high-end, low-end, average. And it shows that Africa's population growth, its fertility levels are going down. So don't fool yourself by saying that Africa has and will ever have a very high population growth, a very high fertility levels, because that's not true. But this figure is a figure that I invite you to print, put above your cupboards or even in your sleeping room, and wake up with it every morning. Because this is a figure which will determine a lot of the world's future. This figure shows that around 2010, almost all continents, except Africa, have more or less succeeded to go through a demographic transition. Even Asia. Of course, very much thanks to China. But in most continents, there has been a rapid demographic transition from about, say, between 4 and 6 children per woman around 1950, the early 1950s, to a level of just replacement rate a bit around it currently. Africa shows the same long-term trend, so a demographic transition that is really there. The expectation is that Africa will have, like all the other continents now, but Africa will have gone through the demographic transition by the year 2100. Then Africa will also have reached this stabilization point. Same number of people born, same number of people die. But Africa started in the 1950s, 60s at a much higher level. Africa started its demographic transition much later, about 20 years later than other continents. The speed of it is slower than elsewhere, as you can see in the graph. And this is Africa as a continent, so it includes North Africa, it includes South Africa. So the figures for, say, sub-Sahara Africa, north of South Africa, are even more extreme and slower. But the figures show that there is this huge gap between the color for Africa and all the other colors. And that is the basis of my story. So, Africa will become a full continent. And it's very likely that during this century, Africa's population will go beyond 4 billion. Or, as some demographers formulate in a bit of a provocation, if that is true, if Africa will have 4 billion at the end of this century, out of every 2 children born on Earth, 1 will be born in Africa. It's not really half, it's I think 47%, but let's formulate it like that. Now, Africa's population, of course, as we all know, has a very big difference in distribution. And so there are already very densely populated areas, but there's also huge areas where very few people live. So can Africa accommodate 4 billion people? Of course it can. Of course. Yeah, in terms of space, it can. On the other hand, there are areas where you have Asian densities, if I may provoke. Yeah? Javanese densities, or East Chinese densities of population already. Now, on top of that, Africa is experiencing and will further experience a very rapid urbanization. So, on top of the huge population growth as such, many more people than used to be in the past are going to live in urban areas and will not have agriculture as their basic livelihood. So, until 1900, Africa's urbanization was very low. And also in numbers, but also in terms of relative position. In 1960, when many African countries became independent, it was already increasing a little bit, but not much. And the colonial policy was very much to keep people in the rural areas, not accepting them in the cities. In 2015, Africa's urban population has gone up to 45%. Some people say even it's already 50%. And imagine the figures. So from 65 million urban people in 1960, it has already gone up to almost 500 million. That alone is, of course, very difficult to imagine, but those are the figures. And with one big footnote, that is that using these geographical terms, rural and urban, for Africa is tricky. Because very many people who are now measured to be urban still have some linkages with the rural areas, and many people in the rural areas also have very strong linkages, growing linkages with the urban areas. And I'll come back to that later. Now, it's very likely, these predictions I take from the international predictions in UN circles, I find them low. I think that we will have a higher urbanization rate in Africa in 2050 than 60%, and probably higher than 70% in 2100. But let's use these figures. But these figures alone are really mind-boggling, isn't it? If you look at the growth that is predicted in cities between now and 35 years from now, just 35 years from now, many of you, I hope, will still be alive then, so you'll all experience it. So you'll experience a shift from not even 500 million urbanites in Africa to a level of probably 1.4 billion. So a shift in those 35 years, all those people have to be accommodated in these cities. Imagine what that means. And then it grows on to probably more than 3 billion at the end of this century in cities. So, I've been to Lagos very recently. It was my first visit to that huge city. And it's the biggest city in Africa now. Nobody knows exactly how many people, so it depends a bit on your definition. But it's a city which is indeed huge, which is in a country with a very high fertility rate. The fertility rate is also still very high in the city itself, in Lagos. It's not just only rural-urban migration. It's also very much the high urban population growth in the city itself. Now, it's also clear that the cities in Nigeria are growing more rapidly than its average population. So I did some very simple calculations. And these calculations get you to these results. So in 2050, If it goes on like this, Lagos will be a 60 million, at least a 60 million city. Yeah? If it goes on like that after that, Lagos will have, what is it? Almost 300 million. You can't imagine. On the other hand, when I was in Nigeria, one of my biggest surprises was the empty spaces everywhere. And those of you who has been to Lagos once in your life? Yes? You have this lagoon. So with a bit of Dutch technology, you can just change that lagoon into an area where at least 30 million people can live. Between the Atlantic Ocean and the inland areas. It will likely, most probably you can't imagine that this is going to be. What you can imagine is that Africa in the year 2060 will have a so-called Atlantic city starting from Abidjan towards to Lagos, one big urban belt of more than 150 million inhabitants. That's very likely. It's already happening. And that's the same what has happened in the belts around Beijing. It's also 150 million. So it's on a global scale, it's not so strange. It happened already. But it will happen in Africa as well. Urban people need food, they need shelter, they need water, they need energy. Many of them are young, impatient, very well informed about the world. Almost everyone in Lagos has a smartphone or access to a smartphone. It will create an enormous explosion of demand for goods and services towards these cities. That's evident, self-evident. Of course, it will not be enough. So there will be a demand for imports, of food, of all those other things, depending on Africa's geopolitical position. I have my doubts there. So I'll come back to that later. And of course, the big question that is very much high on the agenda of the Dutch and European debate is all those young Africans who are not happy enough in the countries where they are living, in the cities where they grow up, how many of them will be patient enough to stay? How many of them will not try to get elsewhere? Not only Europe, China, India, Dubai, whatever. Now, just for your geographical imagination, those are I showed you Lagos, the number 1 city. This is the number 2, 3, and 4 cities in Africa in terms of numbers. All more than 10 million inhabitants. Which are those? What is the first one? Cairo, yes. Second one? No, Dar es Salaam has about 5. Nobody knows. No, Nairobi also has about 4 or 5. 4. No, Addis Ababa also has about 5 now. Joburg? No, Joburg is this one, the last one. That also shows a little bit more modern city. Joburg, of course, part of the Rand. This is a larger area. Nobody seems to realize. Kinshasa. Kinshasa now has more than 10 million, and because you know Kinshasa, it looks to Brazzaville, also 3 million. So Kinshasa, Brazzaville already has more than 13 million, 14 million, maybe 15 million inhabitants. Can you imagine a poor country like that? So for me, let me provoke, but as a geographer, trained as a geographer and as an environmental geographer, some things that are happening will be self-evident. Self-evident. One is, you will see, and you already are seeing in Africa, a major intensification and expansion of crop production. Both expansion, half of it is my prediction, and both intensification, higher yields per hectare. It's happening already, it will continue to happen. Probably a huge expansion, and even more so than in crop cultivation, of animal husbandry. Because richer people, urban richer people, are eating more chicken, and eggs, and meat, and milk, and whatever. There will be an enormous explosion, it's already going on, of horticulture, and of agroforestry. And you have expanding cityscapes, which go counter to these tendencies. So you see the same thing that happened in China, that cities with very fertile areas around it will be eaten up by cityscapes. So you push your agricultural areas out. On the other hand, you will get your urban agriculture. And your high-rise chicken farms as they are existing in Lagos now. Now, the second thing is that there will be higher pressure on land and water. It's self-evident. There will be a threat to the remaining forests and a major threat to the biggest forest areas that are still remaining, the tropical forest areas. And there will be probably, let me say it, killing prospect for Africa's wildlife at the end of this century. There will be an enormous geographical expansion of pressure on land, water and minerals. So not only in areas where it's already a pressure, but there you will have a growing scope of these pressures, a growing geographical expansion of these, with a high chances of conflict, ever higher chances of conflict over natural resources, between people with different identities and with political leaders who easily can manipulate those identity issues, religious, ethnic, language, newcomers, old people, or indigenous people, whatever you need. And all of it will be at a huge cost of nature, biodiversity and climate stability. For me that is self-evident, and I don't like it, and you won't like it, but this is going to happen in the next century. Of course, what if? Is it true that Africa will have so many new urban people with all those demands on food and energy, whatever? No, not if fertility decreases more rapidly than now being expected. Not if youngsters are so scared stiff of the city that they are no longer wanting to go there. Some of them will just jump to Europe immediately and not go to the cities, because cities are dangerous places for many youth in many places of Africa. It's also what you also see in some parts, Kenya is an example, that your elderly people no longer survive in these cities. They go back to the rural areas, go back to the places where they want to be buried. Also, depending on what happens elsewhere, but migration from Africa is likely to grow. And of course that diminishes the people in Africa itself. And you can also have the Malthusian perspective. Some people say this is not going to happen. So this fertility, this ongoing fertility and huge population growth can only end in a Malthusian doom scenario. Epidemics, Ebola, 2 years ago, was a sign that many people thought, now it's going to happen. It will be, if Ebola would have reached Lagos, which it did, and thanks to Bill and Melinda Gates, it did not become a huge epidemic. What would have happened if Ebola would indeed have been successful in Lagos? Let's wait a bit. All right, a few examples that my scenario could be undermined. South Africa. South Africa used to have very high fertility, about 6, not long ago. And South Africa succeeded to go down rapidly, much more rapidly than demographers had expected. And it did not start with Mandela. It started 30 years before. And there's a whole debate in science, at least there should be, there's not enough, but there's a whole debate coming. What happened in apartheid South Africa to cause this enormous reduction of fertility in that country? It means that South Africa, as one of the few countries in Africa, has a bulb instead of a population pyramid. Of course, if we talk about migration out of Africa, don't exaggerate. If you look at the current figures, only 15 million out of the 1.1 billion, 1.2 billion Africans are no longer living in the continent. Only 15 million. And there's 15 million people afloat within Africa itself under the umbrella of internal refugees and so on. So people who can be regarded as uprooted, so to say. So that, if you combine those numbers, it's probably 3% of Africa's population no longer living in the countries where they were born. So that is just not big enough to make a big fuss, isn't it? Also, let's also be realistic. Many of the so-called boat refugees are not refugees at all, then, in the official terminology of the UN. Yes, people from Eritrea are, most probably, not because of famine or because of economic problems, but because of pure political oppression. Somalia, those are still internationally seen as real refugees. But not those Nigerians. If you see the Nigerian figures, then everyone talks about Boko Haram. But don't fool yourself. 95% of Nigerians coming to Europe are Yoruba and Igbo, who come from the southern parts of Nigeria. Those are economic refugees, economic migrants. The ones from Gambia until last week cannot be seen as political or economic refugees. Not political refugees, they were economic refugees. The same for Senegal. So, the very basic point is that I would like to add is that Africa's demographic situation has always been very mobile, and also that mobility and geographical mobilization, people moving around all the time, is the norm. It's not stability. And urbanization is just part of it, but also these rural migration movements all over the place. I would predict that the majority of the Africans are no longer living where they were born, particularly the ones who are beyond 35. Let's look at that this way. One of the striking results of the research I did together with others on the impact of climate change in drylands, we did a global comparison, is that we got access to figures of the population densities in Africa in 1960, and we compared them with the same types of data for 1995. And we were shocked to find two things. One, that huge parts of Africa had depopulated between those 35 years. And the Sahel drought really showed in these figures. But what was even more striking was that you see the color dark red, I think, all along the coasts, almost the whole coast. Dark red means the population growth in those 35 years of 400% or more already. So you have a huge shift towards the coastal areas and some areas inland. But there's a huge mobilization of Africa's population. Okay, quickly, Hein de Haas, one of my former PhD students, now a hero in Amsterdam. He used to work in Oxford. One of the migration experts who say things nobody wants to hear, at least in policy circles. Is it likely that migrants can be stopped coming to Europe? He says, you can try, but it won't succeed. Because migration theory, modern migration theory, says it's not a push-pull thing. It has to do with migration aspirations and migration capabilities. If people are poor, both personally or in poor environments, they won't move at long distances because they can't pay for it. So in poor areas, poor situations, knowledge about elsewhere produce and anger about local situations create anger, frustration, but not migration. The moment you see that there is growth, economic growth, more prosperity, it translates into migration. That's normal, it's everywhere, and it's as old as mankind. So, what you see is that if people become richer, and households become richer, then it's more normal to, at least part of your family, to go elsewhere. It's part of the strategy also sometimes of families, to send your young boys particularly elsewhere, but in some areas also your young girls. And you do that as long as you think that the overall long-term benefits are higher than the overall long-term costs, which is generally the case. This is a very famous and very simple graph, which shows that if you have development, higher wealth, you will have a steep increase of emigration and a slow increase of immigration. up till a certain point where the graphs meet, the lines meet. Now, demographers now dare to say, or economic demographers dare to say where this point is. Paul Collier says it's $5,000 per capita. And that is based on lots of statistical, econometric calculations. You can have your own thoughts about it, but this is basically the simple message. And this is a very, very informative graph given by Hein de Haas. It links migration, emigration, immigration, international figures. It's all international migration figures. It links it to the Human Development Index. And it puts countries in a Human Development Index box and then looks at the blue figure, emigration, and the red figure, immigration. And look at what it does. Now, Africa is generally here and moving here. So, if Africa moves here, there will first be an enormous increase in international outmigration before you can translate that into a huge increase in immigration, which will also happen, which will mobilize the population internally and also bring Chinese, Indians, Lebanese in huge numbers to Africa, and Europeans, maybe. And also, don't fool yourself by just having an economic discourse. Because migration, also migration from Africa, is not only economic migration. A huge part of it is immigration, is migration because of education purposes. This center is one of the centers that is welcoming these students. But also many African youngsters just want to get away, at least for some time, from their grandparents and their parents. They just want to explore. And I provoke our dear Minister Ploemen by just telling her migration is entrepreneurship. And you are so much in favor of entrepreneurship, isn't it? So, should Europe prepare itself for massive immigration from Africa? I think it should. And is it helpful that Minister Ploemen gives 50 million to Africa to create local employment? It helps very, 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 very little. It helps, but of course it's a pittance. So don't be fooled. Now, can Africa expect to create enough employment for its huge numbers of young people who want to work, preferably in Africa? And there, I looked at the lives and activities and accomplishments of the richest African business people. Those are the 9 richest African business people. Do you recognize some of them? You probably know much more about African presidents than you know about African business people. But those people are much more important. The first one, Dangote, Nigerian, Muslim, multi-millionaire, becoming rich because he was very clever to just say it's nonsense that Nigeria imports all its cement, so let's produce it ourselves. Nice friend of the president, getting many, many, many things to be done, to do for the Nigerian government, multi-millionaire. There's one lady. Who is the lady? She is the number 8 richest person in Africa. Dos Santos. Isabel dos Santos. Now the proud manager of Sonangol, the oil company, but also doing much other things. And she was the one saving Portugal. A lot of her funding, her funds that she gathered from clemency, more or less saved Portugal from the same thing that Greece. One of the most remarkable African entrepreneurs. Who is this one? It's not Moroccan, it's the Moroccan king. A fantastic businessman. Fantastic businessman. And now the number 4 richest person in Africa. Okay, what do you see if you look at their profiles? You see that they are still engaged with Europe. Many of them have assets in Europe. Many of them have a relationship with Europe. But ever more they are shifting their gaze from Europe and the United States to Asia. Ever more. And ever more they are also investing in Asia or inviting Asian investors to come to join them. Now, second thing, what is the economic prospects of Africa in the long run? And therefore it's useful to look at the recent period. This is the figures for Africa's exports and imports. 2005, 2012. This was the high-end period. Look at the export explosion. 3 times. Look at what it meant in terms of import explosion. 300 to more than 700 billion imports. Also look at the fact that in the golden year or the silver year of Africa, 2012, Africa's exports were higher than Africa. Very interesting. So the balance of payment was positive. And this is imports of goods and services. Now, what happened after 2012 was that you already see that it was not going so well anymore. And then suddenly in 2015 the whole thing collapsed. From 674 billion exports to 475 billion, 200 billion less in just 1 year. Oil price, copper price, gold price, and lots of these other prices just went down. Second thing is that Africa's imports didn't adjust rapidly. They adjusted in the last year. With the high end of Africa's prosperity, bought prosperity, imports of goods from elsewhere, was 2014, when the prosperity through exports was already winning. Now in 2015 it went down, and look at the huge difference in balance of payments. Africa is exporting 475 and it imports 200 billion more. It can never survive like that. Nigeria is collapsing at the moment, if you follow what's going on in Nigeria. The whole of Africa will collapse now. So we all know about the structural adjustment measures in the 1980s and 90s. Those were a result of balance of payments problems that were much less severe than what we see now. So Africa is in for great trouble. And Africa has to solve these issues pretty soon before it will have a major economic and political crisis. Let's skip this. This is giving a bit of background information how it is. Let me just highlight one thing. Composition of exports still very much dominated by mineral fuels and minerals. Not as the stories in the Netherlands often are, that partly thanks to Dutch support, it's a major success of agricultural exports. Yes, it's also happening, you can show it, but in terms of composition, it's still minimal. Okay, the Trump part. Because you can't avoid talking about what Brexit and Trump mean for Africa. And many of my African friends, of course, ask me, what do you think? And you can look at these nice futuristic things and you can predict what will happen. I said, it's difficult to predict, but I can try. And I do. And I read lots of blogs and columns by African scholars and philosophers about what will happen after Brexit and Trump. And of course, in Africa, 2016 is being seen as a turning point of the world. And Africa basically responds by saying, poor Europe, poor United States. Let's just turn our backs to the north and let's look east and let's look internally. And that's a basic feeling from Morocco to South Africa. A psychological winning mood, despite the crisis in Africa itself, but the idea that Europe is just past. Don't even think about Europe anymore. Don't think about the United States. They're crazy. How can you elect a president like that? You must be out of your minds. That's the mentality. So, many words, but let me go through a few things, because there's so much you can already predict. If you read these African philosophical, there will be deglobalization. The rhetoric is much harsher than reality, but there will be deglobalization. Also in Europe. Africa will become a major battleground between competing blocs. Probably violently. That can be predicted. Violently. So not only economic, but also with military. Chinese firms are already establishing subsidiary firms in Africa. Look at what's happening in Ethiopia. They will do that much more. So part of the Chinese production for Europe will now shift to Africa. That's going to happen. And Chinese firms will also make use of a lot of cheap and eager labor in the cities. Youngsters who like to work for these Chinese firms, like to earn money there, and who produce not only for export, but also for their own consumer markets, which are exploding. There will be, I think, the end of the Washington Consensus. Some say it's weakening, I say it's the end of it. I predict that Africa will no longer be prevented from protecting its manufacturing industry. That's the massive result of the globalization era. Africa was prevented building up its industrial production, and lots of the industrial production was killed because of imports from Asia. It will stop. So suddenly, and you can already see that in the figures, Africa will build up its own huge manufacturing industry. Also, many African states and capitalists, if you look at these richest people, they're all doing it now, are putting quite a lot of emphasis on developing agro-industry for urban consumption. The chickens, the eggs, the tomatoes, the whatever. They will do that on a regional basis. Not just per country, but in West Africa, in East Africa, in Africa as a whole. Dangote, his multinational empire, is active in 20 different African countries now. So he is an African multinational. He's no longer a Nigerian multinational. He's an African. In Africa's periphery, there will be marginalization, lots of upheavals, lots of conflicts. There's one big but, and that is if these marginal areas will start producing solar, wind, and other forms of alternative energy, that might change it. And it's already doing that a little bit in Kenya, in Morocco. I think that Morocco is in a very fortunate position to lead that, thanks to this king and his extremely good strategy. And we can tell a bit more about that. Elsewhere, where this is not going to happen, you will have everlasting crisis, and you will have l'Afrique utile and l'Afrique inutile, like you had the Maroc utile and the Maroc inutile. So there will be huge areas in Africa just forgotten, just written off. Don't care. Let those people come to the city, and let the rest of Africa be for the warlords, the criminals, or whatever. And there is a likely candidate for a first explosion where this will happen, with massive impact for Europe. And that's Egypt. Egypt, I think, is the, some say canary and others say canary, depending on if you're Trumpian or not. This is the children per woman. Egypt had its very high pace, more than 7 children per woman. These children now all get their own children, but less. So Egypt is now at a level of, I think, 3.5 child per woman, which is still high. Egypt had 3 million people during the pharaohs. Its current number of people is about 80, 90, something. It's likely that it will be beyond 100 in 2025, 150 million in 2050 at the current rate. We all know Egypt's population is concentrated in just 3% of the area, and very much dependent on, as far as food production is concerned, local food production on the Nile. And we all know that the Nile and the Nile water is very much being threatened by what's happening in Ethiopia, with the dams. And Egypt is very happy about the turmoil in South Sudan, so that at least there things are not moving. Egypt is one of those countries importing 50% or more of its food needs, its calories, through imports. More than 50%. And it does so already for a long time. How did Egypt pay for it, say 5 years ago? Oil and gas. Egypt was an oil exporter. Tourism, the beaches, Sharm el-Sheikh, Remittances, huge numbers of Egyptians working in Syria, Libya, and in the Gulf states. High aid volumes, both from Saudi Arabia and from the United States. And a bit of profit. And a few more, but those are the basics. What happened in the last 5 years? Since about 2010, Egypt started to import oil instead of export, on balance. So gone. Remittances, gone. Tourism, gone. Cotton, not much. Aid, dwindling, and very much focused on the blue collar military and military training. That's still there. But all the other things dwindle. How does Egypt survive? It doesn't. It already doesn't. So this can't last for another 5 years. And I can say more about Egypt, but let's just put it somewhere in the air. Be prepared that after Europe's flooding by Syrians, there will be a massive flooding of Europe in the next 10 years by Egyptians. Not just 1 million, 10 million, or more. It's going to happen. Egypt is not alone in having to import more than 50% of its food. All the dark yellow colored countries import more than 50% of its food in caloric value. More than 50%. So where does the food come from? From the world market. Where does the world market food come from? North America, South America, and Australia, and very interestingly India. Who would have thought about that 30, 40 years ago? Southeast Asia, Russia, evermore, and some countries in Europe. That's the world balance. In Africa, there's just a few countries with a positive food balance. Just a few. So if you talk about food imports, you talk about climate change. And that's my final touch. Of course, as a geographer, I should never show you these pictures, because basically I'm still very much doubting if you can predict long-term climate change effects geographically. And if you are doing a search on the internet, you will still find quite a lot of different maps like this. So what happens in one scenario is different from another scenario. But let me take a scenario that currently is very much en vogue. It's out of the dice, informative. These are 12 suggestions. And he looks at the rainfall future, and he shows that for Africa, let's look at this, there will be massive drying all over the place, with the big exception of the Great Lakes area. There it will be massive additional rainfall. That's the prediction. What does that mean in Congo? Not much. It rains so much, a little bit less rain, it doesn't matter so much. But everywhere here, in the Sahel and in Southern Africa, it's the basic difference between producing 8 crops in 10 years with rather good results to just having 5 or 4 or 3 almost. So the variability will increase a lot. Now, what is very problematic, if you look at these predictions, is that the big areas where Africa gets its food from will have major problems in this century. And the biggest problems will happen in the United States. So there are some futurists who already predicted by the year 2060, the United States will import this food and not export it. And if that happens, the whole world market for grains will completely be a different market. Now, who will be the biggest winners? You can already see from this map, also if you, it's not a lot of imagination. There are 2 big countries which are going to be the big winners of climate change. It's Russia and it's Canada. For the very simple reason that the boundary of acceptable crop production, grain production, is already shifting northwards quite rapidly. There is a shift of possible grain production of 200 to 300 kilometers northwards already. Look at Finland. That's an example. In Finland, the crop boundary, where you can commercially produce grains, has now hit the Russian boundary. It used to be halfway. So Russia will be the big winner. A huge expanse of areas where there will be more possibilities for grain. The Chinese know that because China is in a process of rapidly exploring the whole eastern part of Siberia to establish huge grain farms under Chinese ownership. It's happened already, it will happen. So, silver lining. Let's look at the silver price of the metaphor. When I gave my silver lining story in 2011, the silver price was at its highest. Then it dropped. It's now here, and the analysts say it's too low. So maybe I'm too pessimistic now. As I maybe was too positive and too optimistic in 2011. But the things I tell you are real. And the prospects are real. And I would say let's not be foolish, let's not be ostriches, put our heads in the sand. Let's just face these figures and then think what it means for Europe, think what it means for you in your work, and it will have massive impact on your work and on the position of you as world citizens. Thank you. So some have to leave it.
Yeah, some people.
I talked a bit. Oh.
Yeah, but they start now. I hope some people can still stay. Dietz came in as well.
Yeah.
Welcome. Just in time for the last word.
For the picture.
For the picture.
Yeah.
I'm a student, I'm leaving.
Yeah.
Or having to leave. I would have a question.
Yeah, please go.
You anticipate any change in the political situation in Africa? You anticipate obviously population decline, resources are going to be an issue, but there is a big issue with resource distribution. So are they going to be changed?
Of course, it depends very much on the leadership and on the elected leaders in Africa, on the military, how they will behave. It's very, very interesting to see what's happening in Nigeria now. Nigeria elected a social democratic president who in his past was a very hard dictator, but now he's a social democratic president. He wants to become a decent president in the sense that he really would like to change corruption and change the whole style of government. He was about to succeed when the whole economy collapsed last year. And he's still surviving. But around him, very many people are trying to rescue what they can rescue, and that means also a run to the bottom economically. It depends very much what's happening in Nigeria, what impact it will have on all the surrounding areas. The same is true for South Africa. You will know the turmoil of President Zuma and his anti-right. It's very doubtful what happens there. It can go from bad to worse. If that happens, it will destabilize the whole Southern African. And let me make a very dangerous geographical determinist remark. Africa started in the 1960s and early 1970s with lots of democratic governments and lots of wise presidents. When there was this period of intensive droughts and intensive ecological problems, particularly in West Africa but also elsewhere, 5 years afterwards, almost the whole of Africa had military governments. Now, of course, it's not wise to say that there's a direct link, but there is a link between economic turmoil and lots of liability in the economic circumstances. Your youth who is getting angry again, their ideas was we are going to be rich, we are going to profit from the huge African growth. Now they see the whole future scattered. And that's really one of the big things in Africa. So how will they relate? How will the youth in the military relate to what's going on? Most likely, big policemen in the United States will no longer care. So most likely depends very much on the leadership in Africa itself. How does the African Union fulfill? What happens if there is turmoil in a particular country? Will the other countries rescue? Look what's happening in the Gambia. The fact that now the surrounding countries are mobilizing their military to kick out of this crazy treadmill if we want to go. We don't know if it's actually happening, but it's a good sign it's happening. And it also shows my story that Africa is no longer thinking in terms of countries, but thinking in terms of regions, so these regions. But if you listen to my story, there are so many different lines. Some of them very positive. My industrialization line is positive. But the international environment is extremely negative. If all that translates into very insecure political situations, then my prediction would be that we will have lots of violence, but also lots of military government, or at least very autocratic government. And some of my colleagues in Morocco, I was in Morocco for this item called there, and they say, don't tell us Europe that we should become more democratic. Look at who you are in. Yeah. So, psychology of looking east. No? That's not depend on Europe's idea of governance and good governance and democracy. Let's just look at Malaysia and at China and at Vietnam. Those are the shining examples for many younger. What I think is a very hopeful sign is that if you look at the professional character of most of the younger local level leaders in Africa, municipal mayors, those are of a much better caliber than they used to be 20 years ago. So there is a whole new generation of university educated, foreign related governors at the local level, at the municipal government, who can make a difference. And probably in your work, if you work in the water sector in African cities, you will find out that these services are much more professional now, and that there's much more technocracy in the way they're being managed than in, say, 20, 30 years ago when Africa was really. Maybe I'm too optimistic there, and we're much more realistic.
Just a question about the industrialization component that you mentioned. And do you have any thoughts about how that links with, say, public health issues and the regulation that might be needed to go along with that in some of the history of industrialization elsewhere in the world? On one hand, you have an optimistic message, but you also turn that into a more pessimistic discussion.
The Kenyan discussion is very interesting, because Kenya now has a number of think tanks who really ask these questions. And they say, that's not, if we do industrialize, and everyone believes they will, let's not do it the European way. Let's make use of the new generation of technology. And let's also make use of the new energy possibilities that are really actively being developed in Kenya is, as you probably know, investing in huge project wind farms in the northwest of the country. The idea is that Kenya will produce most of its energy no longer depending on oil and gas in the future. Morocco is defining its future as a zero-emission future. Morocco is now having the biggest solar area in the whole of Africa. Morocco's technology of doing that, they have huge plans to expand that to the rest of Africa. The biggest bank of Africa is the Moroccan bank, Bank Africa, the biggest investment. They invest a lot in new style industrialization, which is much more sustainable. So the ideas are there. It depends a bit on, of course, how the foreign investors act. So what the Chinese textile industry do. Chinese textile industry is now rapidly moving to Ethiopia, for instance. So how do they set up their new factories, their new textile factories? What technology do they use? How sustainable is that? It will be much less devastating for the environment, I think, than it used to be in the first industrialization period in Africa in 1960. It will be much less devastating to the environment than the Chinese industrialization. But In terms of energy, you can be optimistic. In terms of water use, I have a big one. There will be a huge demand for industrial development. There will be huge competition for water. And again, the Moroccan discussions, they say Africa can only solve its water problem on the continental scale. So what South Africa has been doing by having a whole countrywide water system in which the poor water areas are provided by the rich water areas. Many people are now thinking ahead in, say, futuristic terms and saying, let's use this huge water belt in the Congo for massive distribution. Let's really invest in seawater desalination to make sure that all these coastal cities get their water from new investment. It's futuristic, it's economically still not possible to do that commercially. Sounds good, but it's going to happen.
As a drop in fertility in South Africa, it comes to explain how.
I would like to be able to do that because for me it's an enigma.
Okay.
And whenever I talk about this to people who know the South African situation, they say there are various things that happened in, say, the late 1960s and early 1970s, and part of it was a massive structure within the apartheid government to support rural areas and put a kind of basic support systems in place. That's the more positive explanation. And that was formalized much more rapidly after Mandela took over. Because South Africa now has one of the best social security systems in Africa. Still not perfect, but at least it's much better than it used to be. But it started much before 1994 already. And there are, in theory, there are basically three things that should happen for fertility to go down. Girls go to school for at least 10 years of their lifetime. People are developing an urban lifestyle in which having children is an expensive thing to have. So you invest in the quality of the children, but more in the quantity of the children. And the third element is you have to have some confidence in a old age support, no longer by your children, but by community, state, whatever, or by your own pension system. And if those things are all there, then you see the fertility go. But South Africa, education was in turmoil in the 1970s, 80s. Yes, many girls went to school, but they got lousy education. So is it poverty? Is it quality? Nobody really knows. I think that we really need more research, like social demography research, to find out what's happening. Because fertility rate of 3 and a fertility rate of 4, that makes a hell of a lot of difference in countries in Africa for the long-term future. And how you can go to a lower level, that's the difference.
So what's then the opposite happening in levels? Because still something.
No, in Nigeria as a whole, it's still 5.7. In the cities, it's low.
Yeah, but it's still high.
But it's still very high. It's still about 4, I think.
So what's because that is very expensive to raise your children there, as it's in the cities.
Let me add a complication. There's so many things discussed. In Nigeria, part of the thing that's happening is that there is a huge religious element. So in the Pentecostal movement and in the more radical Islamic movement, there is a massive anti-population policy. So basically, the religious leaders say as many children as possible. Also as part of a competition for strength and power. And in the, at least not all, but in some of the Pentecostal movements, and they are huge in Nigeria, it's just not done to do population planning. It's not done. You don't talk about it. It's the devil. You should not interfere with God's plan. All those things matter. And it's part of the reason why a country like Ghana and a country like Nigeria still has such high fertility rate. But these cultural factors also matter.
Next, we briefly come back to the discussion of industrialization. That was one of the points that sketched out. And you articulated mostly saying we see the leadership learning and leapfrogging logically during industrialization. Right? You know, more sustainably, more environmentally friendly. What about the political landscape that's really needed for that? We also see the leadership learning in terms of the conditions for industrialization, whether it's knowledge-based, reducing contact, investing in ensuring that technology transfer also knowledge transfer, local capability-based, etc. Do you see this positive feeling there?
If you're interested in these things, go to the website of the African Development Bank. Look at their current strategy. Industrialization is one of their 5 high points. The way they describe the industrialization of Africa's future is exactly having all those nice words. So they know exactly what to do. And they are very much aware of the fact that Africa's industrialization can only be low energy, can only be sustainable, blah, blah, blah. But the way is, of course, how to go forward, how to implement. So then the importance of the banking sector is there. So because the banks are the ones funding a lot of these industrial banking. So what position the banks take is crucial. And the interesting thing is that I mentioned this Moroccan bank. They are very much talking the sustainable language, sustainability. Also, some of the other banks active from the north, like NMO Bank in the Netherlands, they use part of that language. And it not always translates into the practices you would like to see, but at least the dialogue, at least the discourse.
But my question was contradictions. They know the business of predicting.
Yes.
So the strategy today is very good. Will it actually be implemented? Is the leadership strategy take this forward?
They have to. Because in the year 2100 there's no oil anymore. There will not be oil anymore. There will not be phosphate anymore. That's to be frank about it. So they have to design a way of industrialization and at least leapfrog a new way of developing the energy basis. There will be massive investments. They have to find water, different ways to get into water and distribute the water. There will be massive ways to become much more lean. So this whole idea about frugal innovation, that's not just a poor man's thing, it's high commodity. So that's happening. But it's now, let's say, it's a 5% thing, in fact. So you see examples, and they are nice stories, nice examples. But of course, they do not dominate the more dominant tendency. That's important. But the reality will counter lots of these things or create massive.
I want to finish up on the discourse of the speakers. I want to know your opinion about the leadership. I guess how does this ensure they should more progress in this position itself in this very massive global population?
Of course, HIV had an enormous impact on the population figures. And some of it even on the fertility figures in the first phase of it. And part of it also explains what happens in Southern. But social demographers studying the impact of HIV/AIDS on people's behavior is that they also saw lots of counterexamples. So women getting many more children because they would like to invest in preventing any of their children dying. Rational. It's very interesting that currently, of course, HIV/AIDS is no longer a deadly disease. It's most so there's a rapid transition to people with HIV/AIDS still surviving, still being able to work, still being able to live rather decent lives with medicine. So that fact also translates into other demographic behavior. But nobody knows exactly. So it's the whole field where we only, the medicine against it is only 10, 15 years old now. It's rapidly. Nobody really knows what the impact of this is. long-term demographics. But of course it has an impact. It of course had an impact that during the Ebola crisis in Sierra Leone, Liberia, Guinea, in that period, of course that had a massive impact on psychology, thinking about how the children are not waiting a little for. Now you see, from what I read, you see the impact. Post-war data in the Netherlands. Now we survive, so now we live our lives and enjoy life. Also with children. But so many different things.
Yes, but we leave it then with the children.
Yes.
They're the future then. Thank you all for coming and all these interesting questions. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
And a little gift.
Thank you.
And this is to reduce the stress.
All right.
Yeah.
So I open
With
it.
all those figures. Yeah, you can.
Let's do it the Dutch way.
The PowerPoint will be available.
Yeah, the PowerPoint and the whole will be broadcast. So it's recorded. And it's on our
Science
website.
moment and
Yeah.
a geography story.
Yeah.
Okay, see you back again. You know, find me in Leiden. Also.